Just by way of quick introduction, my name is Karl Colasante. I am a director with PwC, based in Philadelphia, and been with the firm about 14 years now. And I focus in health industries, working with health systems across the country, really on a whole variety of human capital and talent-related matters, ultimately helping our clients think through how to define strategies and implement programs to address some of the unique talent challenges that they're facing in today's day and age. So with that said, let's dive right in. This is a really interesting topic, and what I brought today is hopefully an interesting mix of some kind of macro level trends that frame the discussion around what we're seeing across the country and even globally in terms of what exactly the workforce of the future is and what some of our clients are doing to prepare for it. And ultimately, hopefully that will leave you as participants with some key takeaways, some things to mull over and think through as you think through the right strategies for your businesses around the country. So what we wanted to start with today is actually just sharing some of the highlights of the research that PwC has done in recent years, first at the very broad brush level. And so what we're looking at here is a summary of some deep research that we've done the last probably 5 years or so to distill down. When you sort through everything that's going on around the world, we've identified these big 5 mega trends that we call them. And I wanted to just start here and kind of work our way from that global mindset on down to what's going on the ground within PwC, in a couple examples of what we're doing, where we're doing some really cool things around the workforce of the future, and again, what we're seeing with some of our clients. So the 5 mega trends here that you see, not going to walk through all in detail, but ultimately we think this is an important place to start any of these conversations because it really frames that broader context for the world that we all live in personally and that we're all operating in professionally. So a lot of changes here. We're going to spend some time talking through the one right in the middle around the technology changes and how emerging tech is impacting the workforce. So we'll get to that in a bit. With that said, none of us have a crystal ball. So when we try to think about what the future looks like and specifically what some of the human capital and talent related challenges are and what the workforce will look like X number of years down the road, the folks at PwC don't have a crystal ball either. But what we did is through some analysis over the last couple of years, we basically said there are a couple big variables at play in terms of the direction that the overall business climate is going to go. And so there are a lot of words on this page, but the way that I would think about this is there's one dimension or there's one variable on each of these axes. So on the horizontal, we think that some businesses are going to migrate more towards the right side of the page where they're focusing on individuals, things that are very highly customized to one person. You get exactly what you want as a consumer or as an employee for that matter. Versus on the left side, under collectivism, we're talking about really looking at the greater good and thinking about the whole, not the individual pieces. On the vertical axis, you can see on the page, the top is basically saying small, local, very tailored businesses versus the bottom is kind of the conglomerate pulling all the pieces together, big business rules all, we call it. And so with that in mind, those are the big variables that we think about in terms of, again, kind of high-level factors guiding the direction of businesses overall. And we've put some research out recently that basically says, with these wonderful colors, we think about 4 different scenarios that are potentially likely to play out over the next 10 years or so. And so when you think about the variables that I just mentioned on the prior page, what we basically said is there's a couple options. And so first, in the upper left, what we call the yellow world, that's all about people. And so what that means on the right side of the page here, we've tried to call out some of the implications to the business and to individuals ultimately. So what that means is, as employees, businesses are catering to employees, flexible ways of working, very focused on diverse workforces and inclusive environments. On the right side, the red world is all about innovation, and it's migrating away from a traditional employee base to actually picking up on gig workers and accelerated pace of adoption of bringing contingent workers into the workforce versus the quote unquote traditional employees. The blue world, this is part of the big business world, is really about corporate is king. You can see called out, this is how you apply, where businesses would look to apply emerging technologies focused on the bottom line, ultimately looking at how to augment the workforce with bots, robots, cobots, all kinds of bots. But ultimately, again, focused on big business. And then in the bottom left, finally, green is companies that care. So bigger companies, but that are focused on the greater good, not as focused on the bottom line. And what we think that really means is that those companies will really be much more focused on their employee base as well. So wanted to just start with this as we migrate from the big, broad, global mega trends down to what this looks like on the ground at some of our clients. And this is still pretty conceptual, but I thought it might be interesting to just provoke some thoughts. And ultimately, within PwC, we don't expect that the world is going to be exactly green or exactly red, but it's really going to be a mix. And like any framework, this is intended really just to provide some food for thought as you move forward. So with that said, let's jump in and talk a bit about emerging tech and some of the things that we're seeing there and how that impacts the workforce. So I won't go through this slide bullet by bullet, but it is kind of interesting with all of the conversation, all of the news on TV and on the internet, and all the headlines in the papers, digital or real papers. It's kind of interesting when you look at this, how varied some of the predictions are. So when you look across the page here, you can see right in the middle, Jamie Dimon, household name for a lot of folks at JP Morgan, is saying, they're going to bring automation into the business, but they're actually thinking that they're going to add heads to the business. Versus if you look in the lower left, reports that automation could take out up to 15% of jobs over the next 10 years. So it's kind of interesting. It kind of reinforces the idea that no one has a crystal ball. And what we think actually, as we're advising our clients, and even within PwC, when we think about the 250,000+ people that we have employed around the world, we think that it's most important to be agile and flexible, because what's the skills and the talent that are most relevant today are not going to be the ones that are most relevant a couple of years down the road. And what we're working with our clients to do is ultimately think, how do you put in place the programs and the practices to help build an agile workforce and an engaged workforce? And I'll talk through some specific examples of that in a bit. Next, I wanted to just highlight, when we look across industries, when we look across types of jobs, this really just calls out some examples, moving from left to right, of where we're seeing disruption and some of the biggest impacts as we think about how things like AI, and other emerging technologies like RPA or robotic or intelligent process automation, even things like drones, machine learning, how they're being applied in different industries. So you can see on the left, the ones where we expect the biggest disruption. It's kind of a wide range of jobs. And what this means in the middle is actually we're seeing a pretty significant uptick in certain skill sets, and maybe no surprises looking at the types of roles called out there. But on the right there in the yellow, what this actually is leading to is actually demand around a number of newer positions and significant growth around things like ethics considerations for how technologies are applied and how you thoughtfully introduce them into the workforce. And ultimately what that means for the people that you have, some of whom probably can be upskilled and others may not want to, or might not be at a point in their career where they feel that's the right thing to do. So again, I think the takeaway here as I look at this is, and as I think about the research that PwC has done broadly, and then also what we're seeing on the ground at our clients, the trends impacting the workforce, and then new technology specifically will ultimately impact just about every job and just about every industry. And that all goes back to the idea that as we're working with our clients, what we are working with them to do first and foremost is not try to predict the future, but ultimately think through different scenarios and be prepared to be as agile as possible. There's a lot going on here, but again, just continuing to call out some key components of research done recently to look at where we expect automation specifically to hit a number of different industries. And again, the takeaway as I look at this, particularly on the right side of the page here, is as you scan down the list of industries, certainly the percentages vary in terms of the prediction of the likelihood of a high risk of automation of jobs. But my takeaway is, again, it's going to impact just about every industry across the board. So let's move from that emerging technologies focus and actually dive in a bit to think about the workforce and what this means in terms of the people. So a couple things just as we move from that broad brush down more specifically to how folks are impacted on the ground within your organizations, within PwC, within our clients, and around the world. It's kind of interesting looking at a couple of the stats called out on the left here. One thing that PwC does globally on an annual basis is we survey the CEOs of thousands of organizations. And as we've done our most recent research, you can see just about all of them are concerned about the availability of key skills. And that's organizations of all sizes, and that's organizations around the world, and that's organizations across all different types of industries. So first and foremost on the minds of our clients are where are we going to get the talent that we need, and how do we develop the people that we have and keep them engaged to make our business successful, whatever the type of business is. You can see in the middle of the page there, over a third of the CEOs that we spoke with are worried about automation putting their jobs at risk. And that's clearly a headline that jumps out when you look at just about any different news media source these days. But as you dig into it, and our point of view is that the goal of most organizations over the longer term will not be to replace people with robots across the board or bots, but it's really how do you augment the workforce that you have, and how do you introduce technologies in thoughtful ways so that the people that you have can actually do higher value add work. And then you put all this together, you think about the disruption going on, maybe within your individual organizations, within your communities, certainly across the headlines that you see nationally and globally. Most folks do not think that they're going to have stable long-term employment. And you couple that with the changing workforce demographics of the millennials coming into the workforce in force, and think that folks are likely to have careers that are going to run 50, 60 years. And the research that we're seeing now and that we're doing now points to individuals actually having not a 50, 60-year runway at one organization, which might have been more common years ago, albeit not quite that long, but really a series of 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 careers over that time. And especially with the rise of contingent workers and the gig economy, folks are looking for non-traditional ways of employment that are becoming more traditional these days. And so when we sort through all the data, one of the things that really stands out as interesting is the point of view of the CEOs at the top of the house and what folks on the front lines are saying. So again, you can see that 80% stat here, right? Top leaders are consistently worried about where they're going to get the right level of talent that their businesses need. And you marry that up with what folks on the ground are saying. Actually, most folks from the research that we're doing, that we're seeing across the board, are saying that the majority of the workforce is open to being retrained, to picking up new skills, and they recognize the need to do that, not just to remain gainfully employed, which we all want to do, but also to be relevant in the world and to be able to contribute and to be able to take advantage of whether it's the availability of new skills through things like gig workers, or whether that's new technologies like introducing IPA so that I can focus more of my time as an employee on the stuff that really matters and get away from manual, labor-intensive processes. So with all of that said, we'll highlight just a couple more things in terms of some interesting tidbits from our research, and then I'll jump in to talk about some specific examples of what we're guiding our clients to do, and some examples of what PwC has done internally as well as we think about our employees around the globe. So, a couple things here to touch on. In the lower left, I mentioned millennials already. When you look at the research and the trajectory just in the US in this case, the data that we're seeing says that by over the next 10 years, millennials will make up more than 3/4 of the workforce, right? And we all can probably rattle off some things top of mind in terms of what millennials are, asking for and demanding in the workforce, both on a large scale and on a personal level. But we know, for example, that compensation is not top of the list when you look at the research in terms of what keeps millennials engaged and what attracts them. What's actually really interesting is that culture and values, which I'll touch on a bit more, generally ranks higher in terms of what attracts millennials to stay with organizations. It's not where can I go to get the most dollars, which might have been the case with baby boomers or the generations in between. So in the lower right, that kind of ties into the idea that most of the senior leaders at organizations that we work with and that we're seeing through the research that we do, acknowledge that their culture needs to change. The way that they operate and the way that they live and breathe as organizations needs to change, not only for them to be successful, but for them to actually attract, retain, and develop the right level of talent and keep folks engaged and excited to come to work. And then you can see the point in the upper right there on the gig economy continuing to grow. So what that's saying is, a few years from now, up to a fifth of the workforce will be made up of non-traditional employees. And particularly when you dive into certain industries like the healthcare space where I work personally, that number is going to grow even higher than that. So it all goes back, I think, to what I mentioned earlier, is we're advising our clients is the game is changing and no one knows exactly what the game will look like a few years down the road, 5-10 years down the road. And so the most important things I think to do are to develop a workforce that's agile and develop an organization that's flexible. So that's a good pivot to actually think through some examples of a few additional stats here, and then ultimately, what are our clients doing and what are we doing to actually put some tangible, practical things in place? So won't drain this slide, a lot of words, a lot of data points, but again, just we're trying to round out the story that the workforce is changing, what folks value as employees and as individuals, we're seeing change. And realistically, whether you're a small local community-based organization, or whether you're a global multinational company, the workforce that you have to engage and the customers that you're interfacing with are more diverse than ever. And the skill sets that you need are housed in many different places than they have been traditionally. So with that said, let's jump in to these 4 areas that from PwC's perspective, we're really guiding our clients to focus on and that we focused on within the firm as we're thinking about our own organization, again, how to keep folks engaged and how to prepare our workforce for the future, whether we have individuals that stay here for decades or whether folks move off into industry or other career paths. So the first here is really around this whole idea of digital skill set and what we call digital upskilling. The whole idea there is really tying together holistic learning and new technologies and helping individuals build new skills. And what we're seeing and what we're advising our clients is that when you think about learning and when you think about skill building, you have to think about more than just traditional classroom training. And so what that means practically is, as we're working with our clients to develop learning strategies, and clients of all shapes and sizes, the best learning strategies are the ones that blend the traditional classroom setting learning with the YouTube, the bite-sized, very targeted, and multi-format learning that we live and breathe. So you think about your ride into work or your ride home. You might be listening to a podcast, or as you're on a train, you might be flipping through a few different news stories or looking up even a couple of new recipes to try for dinner. Those are great examples of bite-sized learning that we're helping our clients design and implement strategies to say, let's actually put programs in place like that. And it doesn't mean that you need to build all the content yourself. There's a ton of it out there from organizations around the world that you can tap into. But let's put the right delivery mechanisms in place so that as your individuals are saying, hey, I would love to build my analytics capabilities, or hey, I would love to figure out how to harness automation in my job because I do a lot of stuff in Excel or a lot of things that require or that involve manual repetitive processes. How do you put programs in place to actually train those individuals and get them access to resources in bite-sized ways so that you start to see incremental progress immediately, not 6 months down the road after a robust curriculum? And why not do both along the way? Next, I touched on the idea of contingent workers. And really, this goes back to the idea that many organizations are going to have workforces made up of the quote-unquote traditional employee that might be there a number of years, plus individuals who have much shorter runways with organizations as the average tenure shortens, as individuals ultimately have multiple careers or change organizations much more these days than they have in decades past. And then also, how do you factor in contingent workers, and how do you develop strategies to not only tap into those skills around the country, around the neighborhood, around the world, and how do you take advantage of digital technologies to enable the collaboration so that you don't have to be side by side for 40 or 50 or 60 hours a week to work together, but that you're able to tap into folks on demand to bring the right skills to your doorstep. The next touched on the idea of the millennials as well, right? And one of the other things that we see with the millennials, with the research that we do, and as an employer, it's interesting. I mentioned that PwC has over 250,000 people around the world, and within the U.S., we're in the ballpark of about 35,000, and our average age is actually 27, and so our workforce is 75% plus millennials. So we're very familiar with this because we live and breathe it every day. So one of the things that we're really proud of and that we really see firsthand within our own firm and then around the country and around the world as well is the desire for millennials to get real-time feedback and coaching and recognition. And it's not just about, I want more dollars in my paycheck and into my bank account, but I really value the feedback to help me develop. And one of the things that we're really focusing on with our clients across industries is when you think about the traditional performance management processes, how do you actually transition them from being annual, retroactive, very text-heavy report cards, essentially, to say, here's your grade for the last year. And how do you actually break that up and get much closer to a culture and a process and a strategy around real-time feedback, so that folks aren't waiting months or years to hear how they're doing, but that they're actively getting feedback on the fly. And a great analogy is you think about a coach in a sports team. He or she is giving feedback on the fly to the players in the locker room, on the bench, on the sidelines. They're not waiting until the end of the season to hand out report cards. So it's really taking that mindset, simple example, but trying to apply that in the workforce. Again, businesses all shapes and sizes and all industries, and ultimately with the intent of engaging the workforce that you have and that you're trying to attract and trying to get the most out of them and have them feel like they're in the right spot. And then lastly here, thinking about culture and the idea that the traditional culture is much more important to especially millennials as they come into the workforce. And as I mentioned, the idea of having affiliating as an individual, as a millennial, with an organization's culture and values and what the business stands for in the organization is a lot more important these days than it may have been in the past, where folks might have that might have been a nice to have for folks. But what we're seeing today, and as we look to the future, is that that's influencing where folks go and how long they stay, as much or in cases more than the compensation or more than the career path. So let's take a few minutes and just highlight a couple examples of what some organizations around the country are doing, and just in each of those four areas that I just touched on. So on the left, you can see a couple examples of what some of our clients have done, and on the right, I won't spend time on it here, but we've also called out what PwC has done internally. So you can see in terms of digital upskilling, great example is 5-6 years ago, AT&T has dedicated $250 million to their employee development programs around emerging technologies. And ultimately, they're seeing an impact to the product development lifecycle that translates into the bottom line. And so certainly not all the organizations have $250 million lying around, but it's a great example of focused, dedicated efforts to provide the right resources, to put thoughtful programs in place to bring digital upskilling, in this case, on a big scale to their employees, and they're seeing the downstream impact. And when we think about culture and values, Southwest Airlines, great example of a culture, something that most folks are intimately familiar with, having flown in their airlines a number of times. They're one of the things that they do to reinforce and to sustain the culture that they've created is by doing shout outs to recognize employees who go the extra mile. So a great example of something simple, something small, something non-monetary, to provide recognition, to say, hey, John, Joe, Jane did something really phenomenal. Let me tell you what it is, and let's recognize him or her for that. And over time, that really contributes to building a great culture that keeps folks engaged. If we move on to talk about the last two areas, good example here, I will actually highlight something that PwC did. And so as a firm, we have 35,000 folks in the US, but we've actually built what we call Talent Exchange, but it's a platform that allows us as an organization to tap into contingent workers around the US and around the world. And so what that does is gives us access to a huge extension, both in terms of breadth and depth of capabilities that we don't have as employees. And at the size and scale of PwC, this helped us more creatively and more effectively meet the demands of our clients and bring the right skills to the right place at the right time. And because this is part of our core business, we built the platform to do this. But there are plenty of examples on the internet, online, and in the headlines of other platforms that are out there that are hosted by third parties, that individual organizations that are smaller in size or that don't want to invest the resources to build something like this can tap into. And again, it's all about how do you tap into the right skills that are out there in pockets around the community around the world, and how do you leverage technology to do that in a way that you don't always have to build up the bench of your organization. And then lastly, I touched on the PwC side with millennials here. But one of the things that was interesting about SAP, just for example, is in terms of the culture that they built and the transparency that they're creating within their organization. When candidates are not a fit for a job that they have interviewed for, SAP actually provides them some feedback with the intent of providing transparency, but also trying to provide that growth. And again, maybe foster a longer term relationship so that if a candidate's not a fit for job A, he or she might be a fit for another job down the road and will walk away from SAP, hopefully with a more positive impression and experience. So with all of that said, just as we wrap up here, wanted to just call out 5 different things here as you think about what all of this means to your organization, and when you think about the headlines that you'll see in the paper tomorrow and as you're talking to your friends and colleagues. Number one, you think about the skills that your organizations have today and those that you need, and what are the right plans to put in place to close those gaps, and over what time frame, and how do you tap into not only the changing workforce that's available as employees, but also how do you start to introduce different technologies, and how do you do that on a targeted basis? Doesn't necessarily have to be fully across the board, enterprise-wide, or with all the folks that are associated with your businesses. Number 2, back to this idea about being agile and flexible, and back to the idea of our little colorful slide a bit earlier. So think about different scenarios and what are the big drivers of what's likely to happen, and what are the implications of those different scenarios on your workforce, right? And how narrow or wide are the paths that you need to take to be ready for those scenarios. Number 3, in terms of innovation and building these skills, lots and lots of resources out there to take advantage of. Doesn't necessarily have to be something built in-house, and doesn't need to be a big, robust curriculum like at your local university. But how do you take advantage of providing employees and individuals within your organization and that you're affiliated with access to the right bite-sized content as a complement to the more traditional learning paths? Number 4, over-communicate, probably a table stakes item, but I think for good reason. Important not only with folks within your businesses and your other stakeholders, but be transparent and communicate and be open about the direction that you're going. And this ties very nicely into the idea of that culture and the SAP example from a few minutes ago. And then lastly, depending on the size and scale of your business, right, this says build the right HR function, but it's really think about the right human capital components and what the right resources are that you need to deliver. So hopefully that leaves you with a few takeaways from today's presentation to give some thought to. And if you're interested in reading more, I just called out a few of our recent thought leadership pieces here. Hopefully you'll be able to access the materials. The links are right on the page here. And with that said, thank you so much for your time.